let's talk about this some more. Claire Fox, Director of the Institute of Ideas and former Brexit Party MEP, joins me now. Claire, good morning to you.
Good morning. Good morning.
Look, this is tricky, isn't it, really? We've got Dominic Cummings. He doesn't really want to talk very much. You've got the Prime Minister defending him staunchly, and the rest of the public, regardless of however they voted in whichever particular sphere and whichever particular election, they're furious.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to know. There's a huge amount of anger about this, but there's anger in all sorts of directions. And it's quite hard to untangle, actually, in which direction it's going. I think that we've all become irritated by the idea that there's a group of people who make the rules and then break the rules, whilst at the same time having very little tolerance of ordinary people when they do the same. You know, we've seen overzealous policing, people being fined and so on and so forth. But I think one of the problems, if we can kind of take a step back, is that the guidelines, which actually do allow a fair amount of discretion if you read all of them, in terms of judgment in particular instances, are not presented like that by the government. So they're often presented as rigid rules where you're not supposed to use your judgment at all. Now we have a situation where somebody has interpreted those guidelines and used their judgment and seems to be able to be given a pass on that. So that irritates people. But
I think it does. I mean, right at the beginning of this, and I always think it's very important to be very clear about where one stands, and in order to have a conversation, I think one has to be honest about where one stands. So, as a radio presenter, there was discussion as to whether we were all going to be key workers, and then there was further discussion to say that having people within a confined studio doing one show after another from that studio was probably not a good idea, and particularly given various different times. So then some equipment was made available to those who were able to broadcast from home.
Yeah.
And I'm one of those people. I've been broadcasting from my home since March. But at the time, I was in London, and then just after the 23rd of March, I received equipment and then made my way to the coast, which is where I spend 3 days a week. Very easy to say, well, is that a second home? I take the view that it isn't, because I'm here every single week. But it is, it's open to interpretation. And what I'm concerned about is for those people who do have more than one home, or perhaps have family or difficult jobs, it's not as easy as to be binary when it comes to interpreting the rules.
Exactly, and it's the people's lives are complicated very often in the way that you've just described. It's not all about kind of rich people with alternative second homes when they make those kind of decisions. But I also know that there were people who had locked down in caravans or in fixed site caravans like that, and then they were told to leave. So people will feel it didn't apply. Nobody was Nobody cared about my particular circumstances. It's because he's a man in a position of power. But I think the government have got themselves into this because, as I say, despite the fact that guidance is fairly flexible, the messaging that we get day after day is very simplistic and doesn't give you much room to manoeuvre. And so people will keep quoting this stay at home, save lives, save the NHS and so on.
And that, I think, is a very important point that you make, which is also that, having said that, what seems to be very uncomfortable about what Dominic Cummings did is that when I left my home, I had no symptoms. The other half was already somewhere else, and my parents, who needed to have guidance, were already somewhere else. And therefore, I felt it was a low risk. His wife had the symptoms of coronavirus, and for that, the guidance was very clear. If you have symptoms, stay at home, quarantine. He didn't do it.
No, but this is the problem: is we've now all become, micromanagers of each other's behaviour in a way that I find almost authoritarian in a way. There has to be, at some point, you have to make decisions. You have to interpret those guidance in the way that you think is most appropriate. And as various people have said over the last couple of days, that if there is a safeguarding issue in relation to childcare and so on, people will say, well, this is why I did it. But the thing that's difficult here is that even in all the instances of high-profile people, a couple of whom have had to resign, they've explained what they've done. Well, I thought about it, I used my judgment, I did this, Some of them have said I made a mistake. Others have said, no, I did it in good faith and so on. And there is an atmosphere of intolerance that means that you're told, no, you made the wrong decision. You know, somebody drives for a walk and there's people snitching on them. That's neighbours, you know, saying they shouldn't have driven. People go to one park because it's less crowded than another park and they think it's safer, but they get caught by the police in that park and are told they're too far from home. These things have gone on throughout this whole period. So one of the questions, a broader question maybe, is that the whole issue around lockdown has been a way of undercutting people, demobilising our ability to make those kind of decisions. And we tend to be very firm about the decisions made on behalf of other people. We've all had experiences of this. I've talked to friends and family members who are incredibly intolerant of other people and then in the passing mention something that they've done, which, to be honest, I think, isn't that breaking the lockdown? For sure. I mean, so
and I suppose, all those interpretations are different. Claire, just finally to you, Dominic Cummings, should he resign? Should he be sacked?
I don't want him to be forced out by a hounding mob. That really frightens me. The way that we saw yesterday, led by donkeys, having these campaign group having this big, blaring vehicle outside his home with films. The way the media have kind of surrounded the house, the Twitterati and so on, demanding he goes. I don't want the government to be influenced by that. There's a separate question as to whether he decides he should stay or go, but to be forced out with such a vehement, intolerant, vicious atmosphere would be bad for politics in general. What I want is, I think this lockdown has gone on far too long now, and the government have got themselves trapped, and they do need to make sure that we get out of the lockdown, because I do think, by the way, it's damaging our sense of freedom and it's threatening the health of people with cancer, with heart problems, and all of the usual things that we hear. And never mind the fact that the economy and the devastation it's going to cause each day we stay in lockdown is going to lead to some pretty devastating impacts. So I want that to be what's concentrated on. And this feels to me as though sometimes it can be a bit of a sectarian argument based on something else, because so many people hate Dominic Cummings that they're using this to really get at him. So I worry about the double standards on that.